Welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. The topic for today is a brand new release by Original Jazz Classics, which is that subsidiary by Craft Recordings, and the title is John Wright's South Side Soul. So I'm excited to dive into this. I am going to talk about it within the context of both the sort of historical element in terms of when it came out and a little bit about the history of this album. And I'm also going to talk about this original pressing just a little bit. Feels like to me there's a little bit less energy these days for sort of formal shootouts, but I haven't really been doing in-depth ones in a while. But I just do think it's important, or it's not that it's important. It's interesting that you know, when there are differences and what those differences are. So we'll talk maybe a little bit about that. Before we dive in, obviously hit like because you know you're going to like this video, but do hit subscribe. So the reason why I say that is coming up on a subscriber milestone pretty soon, like 7,000. It's not that far away. And I was thinking about doing another giveaway. So, you know, hit subscribe so that you know when I post the video, and then you can sort of participate in that giveaway, right? Because that'd be fun. And otherwise, you can head over to Instagram. You can follow me at what_can_brown. So here's the album. It's in shrink, probably causing lots of glare as usual. It's possible for me to rip this off without damaging it. So I want to talk about this, and those of you who follow my channel know that I've been excited for the release of this album for quite a while. It's probably still glare because of how glossy it is. This is one of the titles that I was most looking forward to in the release calendar, and so now that this has come out, obviously the next one is The Quest. Not the next one coming up, but the next one I'm most excited about. It's nice to have things to look forward to. So South Side Soul. This was John Wright's debut album. It was put out in August of 1960. And in the lineup here with John Wright, you've got, it's a trio format, so you just have a bassist and a drummer. So it's Wendell Roberts on bass, and then Walter McCants on drums. Incidentally, this was recorded by Rudy Van Gelder. And it is it fits the category of a classic recording. It just does. Like, this is it's a fantastic album. It's one of those that really went up in value, I would say, over the last couple of years. A lot of the folks that came into this hobby during the pandemic got, I think, the short end of the stick when it comes to you know, trying to find one of these, like a copy of this record. And up until very recently, there just wasn't anything available, and outside of some of those early pressings. And so I think it's great that it was tackled by Original Jazz Classics, right? So this is that, you know, again, it's a subsidiary of Craft. And for this subsidiary, you know, they're using, you know, all analog process, right? They're cut, you know, the lacquers are cut by Kevin Gray at Coherent Audio. It's 180 gram. These nice tip-on jackets that are very nice. So, you know, you're getting kind of the best, you know, hopefully this is what we mean to solve here in this video. You're hopefully getting a great presentation of the album, and ideally, I think replicating as much of the magic as is on the original as possible. All right, so I do want to talk a little bit about the musicians. Somewhat necessarily, actually, because there isn't a lot of information out there about a few of them. And so let's dig into that for just a second. So John Wright is the pianist here, right, and the leader of this session. So he was born in Kentucky in 1934. And I am talking about places here because this album is so distinctly Chicago, and so I think it's important to kind of establish some of this. So John Wright's family moved to Chicago. I mentioned he was born in Kentucky. His family moved to Chicago when Wright was just 2 years old. He grew up in Chicago, and then he was enlisted in the military in 1952, and he was stationed in Germany. And why that's important is because he met and he had the opportunity to play with Marshall Allen, who was also stationed there, as well as Billy Mitchell. So he came back. So after his, after he was stationed there, he came back and participated in the music scene of Chicago for a few years before landing a recording contract with Prestige. So I've thought about this in terms of like how that might have happened, right? Because he was in Chicago. And, you know, let's be real, like, so Prestige did have recording, you know, they had scouts that would go out and seek out talent, but then you also relied a little bit on word of mouth from other musicians. So as I was thinking about this, you know, it's possible that John Wright came to the attention of Bob Weinstock, the owner of Prestige, via Gene Ammons, because not only was Ammons also from Chicago, Wright actually played with Ammons on one of his tours when Ammons was visiting Chicago. So it's possible they knew about each other and maybe had the opportunity to play with each other a little bit before. It's also possible that Wright came to Weinstock's attention because Prestige was recording Albie Stidham, I think is how you pronounce his name. So Albie was putting out an album for the Bluesville label, which is a Prestige subsidiary, and John Wright did support him on that session, and both of those musicians were from Chicago as well. Now, in the liner notes, what we do know is that a scout from Prestige sought Wright out in 1960, got him a plane ticket to New York, and Wright ended up recording 5 albums for Prestige between just 1960 and 1962. And the very first one of those, at least as a leader, was this one, Southside Soul. Now then he followed it up with Nice and Tasty, Makin' Out, Mr. Soul, and The Last Amen. Incidentally, Last Amen was shelved for a little bit and released just a couple of years later. John Wright's final album as a leader, and really just overall, was decades later in 1994, and that was actually his next album as a leader. So there was quite a hiatus between some of these very early albums and then what he did later. He only supported one other session, as far as I can tell, in the early 80s, and otherwise must have stuck to local live gigs for much of his career, because I do know that he was performing, you know, in the interim. He also spent time as a librarian for the Cook County Jail, and actually what we learn in a more contemporary piece in 2014, which was written by or published by the Chicago Reader. So that profiled Wright and referenced that he had 11 children, 33 grandchildren, 19 great-grandchildren, and 10 great-great-grandchildren. This interview was obviously completed very late in life for John Wright. He was blind at that point. Wright in the write-up, and this is actually kind of a fascinating article, so I'll try to reference it in the description if you want to learn more about John Wright. But he admitted that his vice, you know, since his early days of recording, was whiskey, and that's why at least his recording career fell apart. Actually, to the point that he was drinking rubbing alcohol and Sterno at one point. Eventually, he was dropped from Prestige and essentially, in his words, blacklisted from touring. So he did finally enter Alcoholics Anonymous in 1980, which is when he started working that librarian job. So it seems like he got out of music and then sort of had something else to focus his energy on. So that's John Wright, very much a Chicago guy. He did have some kind of like late career concerts in celebration of him as a musician. And you know, in some of these this interview that I referenced that was more recent, he did seem to sort of look back on his entire body of work, you know, rather fondly, I think. So I think that's I think it's a, you know, it's not all just a sort of sad story. He kind of looked back and you know, had lots of great memories, I think, of his time as a musician. So let's move on to some of these other musicians. So there's Wendell Roberts on bass. This was Wendell Roberts' only recorded session. He wasn't even on any of those other John Wright albums for Prestige. So he is a bit obscure in terms of his history, but the information in the liner notes offers a little bit of detail. He was born in Chicago in 1930. Apparently he came from a musical family. He actually started playing trombone, clarinet, banjo, and saxophone, and then finally moved on to guitar and bass. His obituary references that he was a saxophonist and a bassist, which makes me think that he was probably playing both of those instruments perhaps more consistently later in life. And I say later, his obituary references he died at just 59 years old in 1986 in Minneapolis. We don't really know much more beyond that. And so finally, we have the drummer Walter McCants. So he played on just 2 albums. There was this one and then John Wright's album, The Last Amen, which I believe was the last one that was recorded by John Wright for Prestige. The liner notes of Southside Soul reference that he was born in Maywood, which is a suburb of Chicago, in 1930. And I did do an internet search to see what else I could dig up. Apparently his nickname was Butch. He did have a son named Nolan, who I believe is today a professional photographer. It's likely that McCants stuck somewhat close to Chicago throughout his career, but there isn't really much else known about him. So one other quick note about the lineup, and this has nothing to do with the musicians, but actually the producer. So Esmond Edwards is the producer of this session, and he actually wrote the title track as well. So this is sort of an interesting side note because Edwards had been originally hired as a photographer by Bob Weinstock for Prestige, but he started taking on more responsibilities as time went on. So you'll see his name on the cover of a bunch of Prestige titles, maybe similar to how you'd expect to see, say, Burt Goldblatt or Reed Miles's name, referenced somewhere on the cover. So Edwards eventually started producing sessions for Prestige and acted a little bit as an A&R man as well. So I actually came across, this is like a weird, almost coincidence. I came across a bunch of albums from his own collection that I purchased from a local store here in Atlanta. So I kept coming across all of these records, and they weren't from Prestige's sort of primary label. They were on like Prestige International and Folklore and stuff like that, which are these subsidiaries. And I came upon a bunch of them, and they were all promos. And I asked the person who owned the shop, I was like, "What's the deal?" And they're like, "These are actually all from Esmond Edwards's personal collection." And I just thought, well, I thought two things. One is that somebody else got to the Prestige stuff, the main label stuff, before I did. But the other one, I just thought, like, wow, what a coincidence that that I happened to come across it and sort of know who Esmond Edwards was, and feel like it was worthwhile owning a bunch of these international and folklore records that otherwise don't really see the light of day too often. All right, so now that we've got some of the people out of the way, I'm going to touch on the cover just for a second, and then I do want to talk about the music for a little bit. So this is the original Jazz Classics version, and you can see that obviously they did. I mean, it's a very sharp-looking cover. I think it's a fantastic image. John Wright looks really slick. This is the original pressing, and so a couple of things to point out, and I do this every time. You'll note that Prestige, Craft Recordings uses their own catalog number as opposed to the original one that is Prestige 7190. So there's that. But otherwise, the only sort of major difference here is the color tone. Now, the interesting thing is that you could say, like, that this is maybe one off. Why is this one bright? This one is quite a bit duller. It's not as vibrant in terms of the saturation of the yellow. And this is interesting because I know the person who sent Craft Recordings his own original copy of this cover, and his own cover was much brighter as well. So it's not like they didn't have a great source, item to compare it to when putting it out. It was either just a conscious decision or an accident, or they just didn't think it was that important to sort of replicate as bright, or they didn't care. Maybe they just didn't care about making it as bright as it otherwise would have been. Otherwise, these are going to be pretty similar. Obviously, mine's a preview copy. Came from I keep mentioning a collection that I bought several years ago. It was actually during the pandemic. It's like 900 records. I need to make a video about it at some point because it was all promo stuff, and I just think it'd be fascinating. So at some point I'll make that. But anyway, this came from that radio station collection, and you can see again outside of the the catalog number that they're fairly identical. A little bit of difference here at the bottom, which is typical as well, because you're not going to reuse the now incorrect Prestige address. So otherwise, outside of the hue, really, that's maybe the only sort of slight points off, I suppose, for this cover. But otherwise, all the original Jazz Classics covers are fantastic, and I think they did a great job with this one as well. All right, so the headline of this album in terms of the music is it really comes across as a bit of a love letter to the city of Chicago. And so how that manifests itself on this album is that every track on here references a place in Chicago. So starting from the title track, the South Side, incidentally, John Wright's his own sort of nickname locally was Southside Soul. But then you've got LaSalle Street After Hours, 63rd and Cottage Grove, 35th Street Blues, etc. Sin Corner. So every track was referencing a different place in Chicago. And I do think that there's a lot of the sort of tradition of Chicago blues that is represented here. It's clear where John Wright's influences are on this album, and so not only do you hear the Chicago influence and you see that influence in the lineup as well, but obviously the track titles are referencing Chicago as well. And so I think if I'm going to sort of expand on that even a little bit more, I would say that there's an attitude that really comes across each piece on this record, and that attitude is not necessarily the same across all of them, but again, each distinct piece has its own sort of vibe. And what it feels like to me is that the tracks are themselves, in terms of the sound, meant to embody the city of Chicago. They're almost like these compositions come across as like characters in a book or a film, and so there's almost like a soundtrack or score sort of element to it, despite that these tracks are still relatively short. And actually, I don't even think I think the longest one is maybe 7 minutes, and the rest are in the sort of the 5-minute range. So it's not like they're long, expansive tracks. They are blues forward and they are concise, but there is still plenty of space to hear solos as well. I just felt like there is so much, again, personality in each individual track, and that's one of the reasons why I love this album so much, and one of the reasons I was looking forward to it as much as I was. So a couple of the tracks, I guess, that I'll call out specifically, and that I think you should preview if you're like, oh, is this something I should check out? The title track, Southside Soul, starts off the album as well. It is a very moody blues, and the interesting thing is, to me anyway, lately I've been DJing locally in Atlanta, and one of the things that I realized is that like, for the most part, the tracks that I think go best in that kind of atmosphere, if you're like DJing a bar, side 1, track 1. It's like or if not, side 1, track 2. It's almost like, and it is like, the producers in these labels knew to put the some of the best stuff, the most catchy stuff up front, and so it's therefore even more interesting that this opener is such a moody, slow blues. Very unusual for an opener and for a title track, but it has a ton of character, like I sort of just alluded to. The piece doesn't feel piano-led in a way, I would say. Like each of the 3 musicians are equal parties to creating the feel of this track and are equally prominent. And I think one of the reasons why I like this track so much is because each of those musicians feel like they're adding something that's completely different and bringing it together that comes across as this, again, very moody piece. So I definitely think Southside Soul, the title track, is one to check out. So side 1, track 2 is another. So 47th and Calumet. Calumet? I don't know. I'm from Indiana. You'd think I'd be able to pronounce this stuff. This track sounds great. A ton of nuance and personality in Wright's playing. This one does feel much more like he is the leader, much more of a focus on him. But and it is another blues, but it's played in a way that feels like it's giving the piece like its own character. So I mean, those are a couple of the tracks perhaps that I would start with, but I am personally a fan of this entire album. I'm hard-pressed to just listen to a track or two or even a side. Whenever I put this on, I'm listening to the entire thing because I think it works so well as a cohesive album. All right, so I hate to be a broken record when it comes to discussing these types of records by whether it's Kraft or OJC or Tone Poet. But in aid of offering any type of comparison or like shootout, not really, but any type of comparison in terms of how the original pressing sounds versus the versus this latest reissue, I'm gonna say a few things that you're gonna be used to hearing from me if you've listened to some of my other shootouts. So what I would say is that on the original, the drums aren't as prominent. And you don't get nearly as much detail, especially from the cymbals as well as the snare. What you do get, let's see, is on the original, is you get a darker tone to the piano. And I actually really like that darker tone. And it's hard for me to unpack what I mean when I say a darker tone, but it doesn't sound as bright. Well, I guess so that those words kind of make sense then. So it's not as bright of a sound. It's a little bit Gosh, yeah, darker. And I don't know if that means that there's maybe a little bit more bass, or if it means that you're not really hearing sort of the higher frequencies of the piano, but it just feels like it's a little bit darker is the best way that I can say, whereas the reissue sounds a little bit brighter. And what I would say is that I think that this album, one of the best things about this album is how much nuance there is in John Wright's playing. And so what you get with this trade-off of there being a brighter piano on the reissue is you get more of that nuance, more of that detail. And so in that way, even though I like the sound of the darker sort of toned piano on the original, what you get with the reissue is that it brings all of that that nuance and that detail forward, and you get like for example on 35th Street Blues, you really get a better sense of the crescendos. So he's playing softer and louder, and there's a lot more sort of touch. I think like to the extent that a pianist adds character by the feel of the keys, you get a lot more of that from this reissue. Like more, better idea of like the sensitivity that he plays with and all of that. And so I'm a little bit conflicted here because I want to hear all that detail, and I really love hearing Wright's personality in his playing, and I do think you hear more of that in the reissue because it is more detailed. And yet I like the tone of the piano on the original. So, I mean, what am I supposed to say? I mean, I personally think that, it's probably accurate that this reissue better captures what was on the original master tape, and maybe there's some problems, with capturing all of the sonic information on that original, but it is what it is. So yeah, I mean, what else to say about this album? I mean, I guess like who might this album appeal to? I'd say that despite the fact that it's, that soul is in the title, right? I don't really hear this music and think necessarily soul within the context of, say, what Prestige would be doing much later. Remember, this is 1960, and so yes, there is, this kind of blues, heavy thing here, but it's not like some of the tactics that are used in soul later on in terms of like, sort of say repeating vamp and the music just doesn't really go anywhere or evolve. It feels to me like that yes, there's a soul element here, and yes, there's a blues element here, but it's not repetitive, and it feels like there's more complexity to it. And I think it's because of John Wright's ability to play and convey emotion. So that's kind of like maybe restating some of what I just said, but I think it's important to understand that when you're buying this or when you're listening to this music, that you're not listening to, where your head might otherwise go when you think of piano trio and soul. So I'm a big fan of this. This is one of those albums that for me gets a lot of spins because it isn't repetitive, and it's not ambient music really either. Like I wouldn't necessarily think of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a setting. I mean, I enjoy listening to this album, many times, and I feel like I'm always paying attention to something different. And so maybe that's what I mean when I say that there's some complexities, that it's just simply not repetitive, or that it's, again, that it sort of stands the test of time regardless of how many listens that you, that you hear it. So anyway, it's, I'm a huge fan of this album. That probably goes without saying. I already have an original, and yet I sought out this copy because I wanted to hear how it was going to sound, and I'm not at all disappointed. I think that they did a great job with this, as they typically do with the original Jazz Classics series, and yeah, I think it delivered on all expectations, and by and large, listen, when I click the put the video on and do some of these reviews, it's a little, sometimes it can be a little bit of a foregone conclusion, unless we're talking about a Record Store Day release. If it's something like this that I am specifically seeking out, it's probably like, and I already have one, like obviously I've heard it, and obviously I'm optimistic because I have confidence in the label, and so that's kind of where we are. Like I knew I was going to enjoy it, and guess what I did? Obviously, it doesn't happen every time. Every now and then I get disappointed, and I'll be sure to let you know. So yeah, I think that probably kind of sums up my comments about this album. It's a recommend. I think a lot of people are going to like it. So hopefully hopefully they are able to put as much care in the presentation of Mal Waldron's The Quest later this year. So anyway, with that, thanks very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.